Good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and I'm incredibly excited to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Stephen Johnson and Dr. James Hamblin. Thanks for attending. FAN is a nonprofit organization that presents a high-quality speaker series offered free to the public on a wide variety of topics, including human development, mental health, education, and social justice. We have over 125 videos of past events archived on our website and our YouTube channel, so please be sure to explore. And now, formal introductions. Stephen Johnson is a best-selling author and a leading mind of today's interdisciplinary collaborative approach to innovation. He unites a deep understanding of scientific progress with a sharp sensitivity to contemporary online trends. His newest book, Extra Life, A Short History of Living Longer, is an entertaining, wide-ranging, and surprising look at how human species managed to double life expectancy in just 100 years. Last night, PBS debuted the first part of a 4-part series, also titled Extra Life, which traced the development of the smallpox vaccine. Mr. Johnson also authored the cover story of a recent special edition of the New York Times Magazine. He has authored many books, including Enemy of All Mankind, a true story of piracy, power, and history's first global manhunt, just released today in paperback, so make sure you look for that as well. He's also host of the podcast American Innovations and a regular contributor to Wired Magazine, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and many other periodicals. Tonight, he is joined by Dr. James Hamblin, whose work I have followed for a long time and I love. He's a board-certified preventive medicine physician, a staff writer at The Atlantic, and a lecturer at Yale School of Public Health. He's the author of the 2020 book, Clean, The New Science of Skin, and the 2016 book, If Our Bodies Could Talk, A Guide to Operating and Maintaining a Human Body. Dr. Hamblin's writing and videos have been featured in the New York Times, Politico, NPR, The Guardian, Elle, Mother Jones, The Washington Post, The Los Angeles Times, and Marketplace, among others. And he has appeared on CNN, NBC, ABC, MSNBC, BBC, FAN, and on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. So now let's welcome Stephen Johnson and Dr. James Hamblin.
Thank you so much, Lonnie. I think you left a few of the networks out, so we'll have to address that later in the conversation. It's an honor to be here with you, Stephen. I've admired your work for a long time. Thank you so much for having me, and congrats on the book, as well as Enemy of All Mankind, which I have not yet read. I would love to talk about pirates, but I'm not at all prepared to. But congrats on the paperback launch of that.
Thank you.
But I have read, the new book, and so we can talk about that. And I have a lot of questions because I'm a bit of a public health nerd myself. But before we get too specific, can I just ask how you come to a project like trying to take on a book about the entire idea of extending human life? Because I want to ask structurally about how you would even think about approaching that, but just the concept. I mean, what were you, just walking on the street one day and you were like, I think, I can take on this whole huge subject, because that sounds enormously challenging to me.
Well, yeah, who knows? Maybe it was a terrible decision. That's we'll have to decide. But this project has been in the works for more than 4 years. And it really, I think, originally came out of another book that I wrote about public health many years ago, about 15, 16 years ago, called The Ghost Map.
I've heard of it.
Which is about, arguably the most famous story, and certainly epidemiology, which is about how the Victorian doctor John Snow solved the mystery of where cholera was coming from, and through kind of amazing detective work, shifted the public understanding of cholera from being a miasma-driven disease to something that was being transmitted in the water, which was a major breakthrough in public health. And one of the reasons that I had written that book is that I wanted to remind people how much progress we'd made in a relatively short amount of time. That book takes place in 1854 mostly. And that was only at the time I was writing it 150 years before, basically. And the the reality of life in a big city back then was that you could drink a glass of water and be dead of a terrible intestinal disease within, 72 hours. And it just happened all the time. And so it was a reminder, it was intended to be a kind of antidote to our historical amnesia that we have about progress in medicine and health, that we forget how many threats have been eliminated. And so that was always, that book actually is kind of the best selling of all my books. And that kind of message of reminding people about this kind of progress is always something that I think is important to do. And so about 4 or 5 years ago, I started thinking that maybe it would be interesting to structure basically a history book where the subject matter was not, a great political leader or a military conflict or social movement, but a number, a kind of a demographic number that really measured how, monumental change was happening in society. And I knew that there had been a kind of rough doubling of life expectancy globally from the end of the Spanish flu, around 1919, 1920, to the present day, depending on how you measure it. In the United States, it goes from 42 to about 77 or 78. Globally, it probably goes from something like 35 to 72 over that period. The numbers are a little bit blurry, but it's effectively a doubling.
Yeah.
And so 4 years ago, when I came up with this idea, I thought, well, there will be a nice historical peg, because the book will probably come out in 2020 or 2021. And I was hoping there would be a TV series. And it would be the 100th anniversary of the end of the Spanish flu. And so it would have a nice kind of historical rhyme to it, that this story of progress in human health, really, I think the most amazing thing that we've ever pulled off as a species, that we were able to kind of double the average lifespan in that period, that it would be on the 100th anniversary of the Spanish flu would be a nice kind of timing for it. And I'd always thought that the first, one of the opening chapters and that the opening episode, if we were able to make the TV series, would be about vaccines and about mass vaccination, because that's a big part of the progress in human health. So that was all in my head like 4 years ago. And then 2020 happened. And suddenly everything that I've been writing as this history of 100 years of progress, all of the themes of the book, the importance of public health, the importance of using data in tracking epidemics, the importance of mass vaccination, the importance of clinical trials to determine the efficacy of new drugs and treatments, everything was just front page news. And in fact, the television series we made entirely post-COVID. I'd written the book mostly pre-COVID and kind of updated it in the final version. But the show was made entirely in late 2020, early 2021. And so it is, I've kind of come to think of it as like a 200-year history of right now. Like that, everything is kind of, that is the most urgent things in the world right now are kind of woven through this history, which is when you write about history, you don't often get that opportunity to have the present be so, or have the past be so animated by the present with this project. So I wish it were timely for happier reasons, but yeah. This is where we are.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask about the pandemic, of course, because it's clearly relevant to so much of what you write about in the book. But getting back to like just the bigger picture of it, how did you think about structuring an entire book, a book around something as vast as this, where there's not a single narrative, like there might be with the choleric of 1854, or there's not a single protagonist, but there's this vast idea, and you're tasked with, encapsulating it in. It seems like a lot to have like 80,000 words for a book, but then when you set down to capture something like this, it actually becomes quite difficult to narrow down how you're going to choose your stories and how you're going to frame everything.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something we could nerd out about. Structuring a book is, one of my favorite things to think about, and it's one of those things where, a lot of thought goes into it. And then I think most readers aren't kind of aware of how complicated the initial structuring decisions are. If you've done them well. If you've done them poorly, they're like, this book is a mess. So there are a couple of things. In some ways, it's even harder than what you described, because as you know from reading it, one of the arguments that it makes, and that is really something that has run throughout a lot of my work, is that when we think about momentous change in society, when we think about innovations, when we think about progress, the stories we tend to tell ourselves to explain that are often kind of caricatures of what really happens, because they like to condense everything down in these very clear, there's a hero, there's a rogue scientist who the establishment doesn't believe, and they somehow, with their outsider perspective, manage to change everything, or there's a sudden moment of epiphany or eureka moment. And in fact, when you look at even a story like The Ghost Map with Jon Snow, which seemed to be the archetype of that, it turned out when I actually started to research that story, there were a bunch of people and that were crucial. Snow was crucial, but there were other people around him. And so a lot of my work is about showing that networks, kind of collaborative networks, often of people with different talents, are really the kind of primary agents of change when you have really momentous change in society. And so not only is the story of life expectancy a story where like it's made up of lots of different breakthroughs, but each of those individual stories has multiple protagonists and heroes. And so it's a daunting thing. There are two ways that you could basically structure a book like this. You could do it straight chronology, and then in 1854 this happened, and then people started living a little bit longer, and then in 1870 this happened, and people started living a little longer. That didn't seem to be as interesting to me, although in a way the Times Magazine piece that I adapted took that structure a bit. What I really wanted to get at was this question of what were the big drivers. So we know we know the end result. We know life expectancy was here, it ended up here. And I wanted to figure out what are the main things that are kind of propelling that change. And so I ended up, after kind of doing a broad survey of, kind of theories of what actually drove the change, dividing it up into chapters loosely organized around the big drivers. So vaccines is number one, but data, for instance, is a big factor as well, and medicine, particularly penicillin and antibiotics. So the chapters kind of follow one of these major forces. And once I had those chapters, that kind of structure, then you knew there were some coherent stories inside of each chapter. And I think it's almost structured like a bunch of separate essays. There's kind of a meditation on where vaccines came from and where they took us, another on data, et cetera. And I think that makes it more legible in a sense to the reader. Once they get into those chapters, you are following kind of coherent stories, and there's some great, really, to my mind, really interesting stories in this book that hopefully most people won't have heard before. So once I had that structure, it was a little bit less daunting.
Yeah. As a physician, it was actually pretty disheartening to read to see how you broke it down, but that you were able to break it down in only a few things that were actually major drivers of this massive change that of all the, trillions of dollars we spend on pharmaceuticals and diagnostic tests and hospitalizations, that there's actually only, several things that can be drawn out that can truly be said to be contributing to this massive change. How do you figure out which are these major drivers that I'm going to focus on?
Well, it's just a question of going through. There have been a bunch of kind of essays and papers and research that look at what they would call the determinants of mortality. That have tried to map these out. It's all kind of orders of magnitude, right? You can't. I initially had this idea of maybe you could really quantify it and say, okay, we got 6 years from this, and we got 2 years from this. But the thing that I think is really interesting, I think it's probably the most surprising to me. One of the most surprising things to me about the whole project as I researched it was that how late medical science and medicine proper arrives on the scene as a material positive impact on human health. That, of course we have vaccines, but beyond that, kind of taking some kind of pill to improve your health and cure the disease you have is something that really, for the most part, starts with penicillin and antibiotics in the 1940s. And up until that point, we have some fun in the show, and I have a little bit of fun in the book at like looking through the drug catalogs from like 1908, and it's just like, would you like some arsenic with your cough medicine? It's the kind of general tone of it all, and it's a really interesting thing because we think of modern, pharmaceutical companies as being kind of this icon of modern progress, and in fact, it is now an icon of modern progress. We have a lot more, drugs that actually do work, but it just didn't show up until remarkably late in the timeline. And so that led me down this path of trying to figure out why, right? Why did it take so long for, medicine itself to be helpful? And that helped me understand some of the other innovations and kind of shifted my perspective a little bit. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting about the history of medicine is that the FDA, until the late 1930s, the only real obligation that it asked of pharmaceutical manufacturers is that they include accurate representations of the ingredients in the medicine. That's the only thing they asked. Like you could, as people did, you could put antifreeze in the medication and kill people with the medication, and they would be like, well, as long as it says that it's in there, that's fine. You want to put mercury in there, that's fine. And so there was no question of like testing to see whether it was dangerous or testing to see whether it worked. And so the pharmaceutical manufacturers pretty much had free reign to do whatever they wanted. And so it led me to this, important realization in the book. It's a big theme of the book, which is that we, and then I'll stop talking. I'm rambling on a little bit too long, but we tend to focus on when we calculate, what were the big breaks? What were the big drivers? We tend to focus on objects, right? They invented the X-ray machine, or they invented the fMRI machine, or they invented penicillin. But sometimes it's the institutions that get developed and the systems for testing and ensuring safety that are equally important in driving progress. But we don't tend to have like heroic narratives about government regulators, to our discredit, I think. But so there's a whole thing in there about the invention of the FDA and how that came about that I think deserves more attention than it normally gets.
Yeah, it sounds like you're running up against some of the similar challenges that I often do covering health and science. Is that the compelling narratives, like you say, you mentioned even explicitly in the book, are following this outsider hero, single person who turned conventional wisdom on its head, or this one, drug or discovery that completely changed everything. It's just an attractive narrative, but you're pushing back against that with this book and saying it's this network effect that we need to think about more. It's not like the Gladwell outsider, like single person who happened to upend the system. Yeah.
And the other thing about it that's so tricky that makes writing about health so important, I think, is that I started by talking about how we forget the threats that we've overcome or that we've reduced to very unlikely events. And I think there's a reason that amnesia is understandable on some level, because progress in health is different from progress in technology or progress in, building skyscrapers, right? Because when you have technological progress that lets you build a skyscraper, lets you make a smartphone, you can look at the smartphone in the skyscraper and say, look, there it is. That's an icon of, you know, how far we've gone. Whereas on a real level, like progress in health is measured in things that didn't happen. Like the smallpox infection that you didn't get when you were 2 and die from because smallpox was eradicated in the late 70s. You know, the cholera that didn't kill you at the age of 5 from your drinking water because we, you know, built sewers and chlorinated drinking water. The car accident that didn't kill you because you were wearing a seatbelt or had an airbag. And so it gets easy to forget these things because we don't see them. We don't think about them because they didn't happen. It's an understandable kind of omission. And so that's why I think it's so important to write about these things. And I think when we can get into the current crisis, you know, in due time, but when we see anti-science movements, when we see, you know, distrust of public health officials, I think that stems from not being reminded of the value that they have brought to us and the benefits that we have, you know, gotten so accustomed to, we don't even think about them anymore.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about them. You know, right now, we are entering the phase of the pandemic where we are suddenly jumping from, there's a shortage of vaccines and people are jumping the line and pretending to be elderly in order to get a vaccine, into the phase where we actually can't like pay people to get vaccines. But this is an issue of history repeating itself. This has always been an effect. What can we learn from looking back at history about how to counter that?
You know, I just literally saw just a headline on Twitter before I came in here that Ohio is going to do a lottery program, not a lottery to like see who gets a vaccine. Like everyone vaccinated is going to be entered in a lottery, and the winner each week will get $1 million. So they're like using like lotto mechanisms to get people to take vaccines, which you know, okay, whatever it takes, I'm happy with that. So it's interesting to see what's going on in that way. So, you know, you make a really important point that there is a lot of history to the vaccine resistance or openly anti-vax movements. You know, there is something, I mean, you know, this is a physician, like there is something intrinsically complicated about the medical intervention of a vaccine, because you were treating someone who is by definition not sick, or most of the time is not sick. And often, you know, it's with children too. So you're taking a healthy child and you are giving them a treatment even though they were not sick yet. And in the early days of vaccination, particularly in the really early days, when I talk about the kind of evolution of vaccination out of variolation, which came before it, which was, you know, taking actual, you know, pus from an actual smallpox victim and inserting it directly, you know, with the lancet, or grinding it up and snorting it in your nose, or blowing it up the nose of the child. Yeah. And you know, there's 2% of people who were variolated died. I mean, it was a legitimately dangerous thing, but smallpox was so deadly that the odds were better. So there has been, I mean, I talk about this in the book, and it was in the episode that aired last night. My co-host David Olusoga did a wonderful kind of piece about it, basically in the episode, that anti-vaccination movements were huge in the 19th century, probably bigger, I would say, per capita than they are today. And they involved a lot of kind of prominent scientists at the time. So it was a complicated, it's always been a fraught, of all the medical interventions, it's the most fraught for the reasons that I just described. But to me, part of the lesson is, and this is a big theme of the book, is that when we try and figure out how these momentous changes happen, when we're trying to figure out like what really drove, this is largely a positive story, which is nice to have every now and then, particularly over the last year. And so when we try and figure out how did these positive changes happen, it is often driven initially by scientific advances, medical advances. But it's also just as important to have people who aren't necessarily scientifically trained, aren't necessarily medical professionals, who are great evangelists for these ideas and who are out there in the public sphere fighting for these ideas. Dickens, who I sneak, because I never wrote my PhD many years ago, which is going to be on Victorian culture and Dickens, I sneak Dickens in every one of my books. I think he's been in every one of them, actually, or another. But Dickens was a major vaccine advocate, and he wrote about Jenner and wrote about the importance of this miraculous invention and the importance of getting vaccinated. And he wrote about it in his mostly in his magazine Household Words. But it was people like that who are very influential in the society, who are not necessarily trained as physicians, but have that soapbox. They matter as well. And the last thing I'll say is that maybe the most kind of easy to grasp example of this is pasteurization and milk. So another thing people forget is milk was very dangerous in the 19th century, particularly in big cities where you didn't have refrigeration, the cows were far away, people were crowded together, created all sorts of problems. You could get all sorts of diseases in milk, and it was a major killer of children, right? So childhood mortality in New York City in the 1850s was 50%, right? I mean, it was a very, very dangerous time to be a child, and milk was a major culprit. So pasteurization is invented by Louis Pasteur, right? His name's right there on the carton of milk, in 1865. So that's the scientific breakthrough. And that's great. We need to have the chemist to solve these problems, and he's a household name for good reason. But we don't get pasteurized milk as the default standard in grocery stores in the United States until 1915, so 50 years later. And that's because the idea itself wasn't enough, right? You had to fight for the idea. You had to have people who were out there changing people's consumption habits, convincing them to drink this stuff. You had to fight for legal reform to mandate it. You had to convince the milk manufacturers to do it. So the progress is a mix of scientific advances with social engagement and activism. And that's the really powerful combination. It's not just empirical enlightenment science that does all the work for you.
Yeah. I think you put that really nicely in the book as I wrote it down. Vaccination was a triumph of persuasion as much as empiricism. And that really stuck with me, because right now I feel like people are coming to me asking, how do we talk to, vaccine hesitant or anti-vax family and friends? And they want to be like, how do I bombard them with more facts? But it sounds like one of the lessons of your research of this book is we need to think beyond that, think about narratives, think about emotions, think about how you actually, persuade and convince people to believe things. And especially at this point, if, for the Americans who've decided to forgo vaccination, do you think that there are lessons you can take from what you've learned and written about that might apply to, this specific phase of the pandemic when people are dealing with people who need that persuasion?
It's interesting. My sister is a doctor in North Carolina, and I was talking to her about this the other day, and she's like, a huge key part of my job right now is persuading people to get vaccinated. And it's like, she has all this medical expertise about like, this is what I should prescribe to you, and this is how I can diagnose this issue. But like right now, her like most needed skill is the power of persuasion. They're like, well, she's literally like, I don't trust that Dr. Fauci. I'm not sure about him. And she's like, okay, let's talk this through. I think there are two things that I think are worth sharing that come out of this wider project, including the TV show and the book. The first is, I think particularly if folks get to see that episode that aired last night, it ends with the story of smallpox eradication, and it's built around a conversation with this guy, Larry Bryant, who was a part of that effort, who is a wonderful figure, someone I've known for a long time. And so we have this kind of conversation where he walks me through the story. And I always kind of tear up a little bit when I watch it. I think it's a very moving story. And one of the things you see when you watch it is just these images that are incredibly disturbing of smallpox victims. And you think about the legacy of that illness, that virus, which dates back to the pharaohs. I mean, it was an ancient curse on humanity. And through vaccines, we eliminated it altogether from the face of the earth. No one, hundreds of millions of people died of smallpox. And then starting in 1977, there was none. And it was a global effort, right? I mean, that's one of the great things about it. It's just this incredible collaboration including the United States and the Soviet Union in the middle of the Cold War. So, they had all these nuclear weapons facing each other, but they were still able to collaborate on these health issues and treat it as a truly global problem. And so you look at that and you say, okay, look, people don't remember how bad it was, but you look at those images of these people with smallpox and you're like, wow, that was an amazing thing that vaccines and thinking across borders can do. Let's maybe apply that to our own crisis. The other thing is, my sister said something also about her persuasion. She was talking to someone who was very religious, and she said something like, well, I think we should see these vaccines as a kind of gift from God, in the sense that they are miraculous. I mean, this has been covered, I think, pretty extensively, but it never ceases to amaze me that, particularly the mRNA vaccines, that, they had the plan for them in early February. I mean, maybe late, they basically kind of designed the mRNA kind of structure based on the spike protein that they'd gotten out of the genetic sequence of the coronavirus that had been released in January of last year. So, if we think about where we would have been had COVID arisen just 10 years ago or 15 years ago. I mean, as you know, it took us 4 years to just identify the virus that caused AIDS in the 80s. Just 4 years to like find the name of the thing, much less start thinking about a cure for it or a vaccine, which we still don't really have. So the fact that we were able to develop these vaccines so quickly, and they're in the show, I interviewed that episode last night. I interviewed Fauci, and it just happened to be that I interviewed him on the day the efficacy numbers came back for the Moderna vaccine, and he was just bouncing into the room. He was like, I mean, 95% efficacy. Like we would have taken 60 in a heartbeat. Like, I mean, you have no idea how good this is. We just got an incredible lucky break. So it, I think to tell people, like, this is a miraculous thing that happened in a very dark year. We could have been waiting this out for another 2 or 3 years easily. So why would you say no to something that is such an extraordinary gift in the middle of this crisis?
I don't know. I mean, I obviously agree with you. Do you think maybe if we could do a better job of telling stories and focusing on history, is it a matter of people not being aware of these recurring lessons of history where we seem to keep forgetting about things like the importance of vaccination or the, sort of lack of power and just closing borders, the idea that you can't just, isolate yourself and be rid of the threat of infectious disease? Is it a matter of ignorance and forgetting, or is it just human nature that we are going to continue to focus on our own individual well-being and forget that health is a collective endeavor?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, I mean, I think there is I understandably, because what I do is tell stories, I guess, on some level. I do think that stories are important in changing people's attitudes. They're sticky. They get shared. They move people. And So, the analogy I like to use is like every kid knows the story of the moon landing, but does every kid know the story of smallpox eradication? And, if you think about it in terms of material impact on people's lives, smallpox eradication was a much bigger deal and was equally heroic and was a triumph of science, only it was a collaborative triumph. So part of it is, I think, we don't teach this stuff enough. There's one of my favorite sections of the book, and in the episode that's going to air next Tuesday on PBS, there's the story of penicillin, which is, conventionally the story about Alexander Fleming and this Petri dish he leaves out, and it gets accidentally contaminated by the mold spore that falls into it, and he, has this sudden moment of epiphany that he calls it penicillin. And, people like that story because it's like, he's like the patron saint of people who keep a messy desk, right? It's like, if I just don't clean up, I'll win a Nobel Prize someday, people like that. But in fact, the story, Fleming is a part of it, but really the story is about, not just identifying this antibacterial mold, but seeing whether you could make enough of it to make a difference just in one patient, much less the whole world. And that was an open question. And that involved a whole different team, and a team initially at Oxford that ends up coming over to the United States, embarking on this top secret mission because it's in the middle of World War II. And they realize that, something that can stop a bacterial infection is going to be a serious advantage in the middle of the war, because so many soldiers are dying in hospitals, as it's always been the case in the history of war. Most soldiers die from their infections and their wounds, not from the wounds themselves. And so there's this amazing race against the clock, this thrilling global collaboration behind the scenes nobody knows about, trying to make this thing in up to scale. And they end up making enough of it that it's in the packs when the soldiers land on Normandy beaches in D-Day, like they've got penicillin with them, which is incredible. So again, just like the moon landing, when you ask people, like, what's the story about a bunch of international scientists racing against the clock to solve a really complicated problem during World War II in a top secret mission, it's the Manhattan Project. It's, building an atomic bomb. But penicillin is just as good a story, only it's a life-saving drug that's getting invented, not a weapon of mass destruction. But that's not the one we tell as much. And so I do think that there is an imbalance in the kinds of narratives that we tell ourselves in society. And there is, as important as it is to recognize military heroes and things like that, I think, look, this is another lesson from the pandemic is, who was keeping us safe this year? For all the money we spent on military in the United States, it wasn't really all that relevant to the crisis, to the loss of all those lives.
Yeah.
And so if you compare public health spending to military spending, they are not similar numbers.
No, they're nowhere near, right? And I don't know what the moon landing ended up getting us, other than like some sort of superiority over other parts of the world. And it's tragic to think about the idea that we might have developed antibiotics only because, or primarily because, they could help keep our people alive, so that they could kill other people in the field of battle. But perverse motives aside, I think you have an interesting tension in the book where you're highlighting a few things like vaccines and antibiotics, which are kind of squarely in the domain of medicine, as being crucial to longevity, to extending human lifespans. But overall, the argument seems to be that kind of public health measures and network effects are more important than most of the individual efforts of specific procedures or pills. How do you think about that tension where you have the pharmaceutical industry, which is mostly telling us like there's this one pill that's gonna, change everything, keep you alive, versus the tension of like public health being generally more important but underfunded, while pharma is also like clearly doing important things, as we see right now with the pandemic?
Well, yeah, I think that, as you say, just there, kind of big pharma, for-profit pharma has become a much more kind of positive. There are problems with it, and there are blind spots in it. We aren't developing new antibiotics because the economics of antibiotic development doesn't really work for pharma companies, and that's a problem because of bacterial resistance. But there are amazing drugs that are coming out. And look, the COVID vaccines, the model of like kind of open source style academic research funded by government, collaborating with the ingenuity and the scaling prowess of private companies. That's a great model, and it does a lot. It does a lot of good in the world right now. It didn't do a lot of good for a long time, and the big kind of material advances that happened between, say, 1850 and 1950, a lot of that came from, a lot of it came from cleaning the drinking water. Whether it was routing the sewers separately from the sources of drinking water, which you would have thought was a self-evident way to organize your society, but it took people like John Snow fighting for it and explaining that it was important to put the human waste in one place and the drinking supply in another place. But also chlorinating water, which was a whole interesting battle, and then milk pasteurization and things like that I talked about. So those were one of the wonderful things about that. We haven't even touched on this is a major theme of the book and the show, which is, it's not just about the overall upward march of the average of life expectancy, but it's also about the gap. I'm illustrating, I don't have any charts, so I just get to make little hand gestures here. Something that I found kind of shocking, it's fascinating to me in this research is, until about 1750 or so, average life expectancy around the world was very low. It was about 35. That was driven in large part because about 40% of children died in mortality. So in before adulthood, right? So you have very high childhood mortality rates. Yeah. But that was the average age everywhere you looked. It didn't matter whether you were the King of England or a pauper somewhere or a hunter-gatherer. Your average life expectancy would be 35 and 40% of your kids would die. So you had tremendous wealth inequality, but you didn't have health inequality. There was no advantage to being affluent. And that started to change. And part of the story of the last 200 years is both an overall average going up, but also this gap opening up. And to this day, like you can go 3 stops on the subway here where I live in Brooklyn and just go, 2 neighborhoods down, and average life expectancy in that neighborhood will be 9 years less than it is in my neighborhood. And I could go to some parts of Manhattan, it'll be 5 years longer than in my neighborhood. And so that's, to me, that's the most fundamental form of inequality that there is. Like how much time do you have? And so one of the things that's so important about the public health infrastructure innovations, like clean drinking water, is that it was a very egalitarian intervention. It really made a difference to the whole population. It wasn't something that was just the elites were benefiting from it. And in fact, initially in places like the United States in the 20th century, the gap between rich and poor started to narrow. And then over the last 30 years, the gap between the industrialized nations and the rest of the world has also narrowed. It was probably the biggest it had ever been around 1950. You had people living to average lives of, in their 70s in Europe, while people, in the Indian subcontinent were still living average lifespans of 25. And that has dramatically changed since then. And so when we look at the story of the progress, you want to look at the overall average, but you also want to look at the distribution, basically. And that it's 2 stories you have to keep your mind on.
Yeah. I was going to ask about that, but and I understand we're kind of nearing the end of our time period here, so I'm going to roll my questions into one huge one.
Good.
Is it good that we are living so much longer than we used to? And that factors in the disparity issue, which is raised apparently by this advance?
Well, it's a great question, and it's a profound question, I think. And so it seems like the answer should be obvious. Yes, we want to live longer, right? Why wouldn't you want to live longer? But there are two ways in which I think it's more complicated. The first is something actually I don't talk about as much in the book. I allude to it at the end, but there's a distinction between what people call lifespan and what people call health span. Lifespan is just how many chronological years you get until you drop dead. Health span is what's the span of that time where you're fundamentally healthy and you're out in the world, you're wear and tear as you get older, but you're not bedridden. You have control, over your faculties, your memory is intact, all those things. And there is some argument that we have gotten better at extending life, but that health span hasn't caught up to the expansion of life itself. And so we have longer periods of time where people are, this is the chronic diseases of old age. There's so many Alzheimer's people with Alzheimer's because people are living longer and they're getting it and they're kind of having these last 5 years that are really, it's not on some level maybe worth it for them to be alive in terms of their own experience. So that's one question. The other question is, and I think I don't think we think about this enough. We went at the end of the Spanish flu, there were about a little less than 2 billion people on the planet. Now there are a little bit less than 8 billion people on the planet. And there's, you hear people be like, hey, people have to stop having babies, whatever. Like per capita birth rates have gone down over that period. In many places, they're below replacement levels. We went from 2 to 8 billion, not because people started having more babies. We went from 2 to 8 billion because people stopped dying, and particularly children stopped dying. And older generations stuck around to be grandparents and great-grandparents, and those generations stacked up, and the descendants of the children that didn't die had their own children. And that's how you go from 2 billion to 8 billion. And so we have the climate crisis is, as much, if we just kept the population at 2 billion and industrialized the way we have, we wouldn't have nearly the climate crisis we have today, because there just wouldn't be enough people generating enough carbon to make as much of a difference in the atmosphere. And so in a strange way, the climate crisis is industrialization plus the triumph of public health. I mean, it's perverse to kind of think of it that way. We tend to just focus on, our carbon lifestyles and everything else, but it's also that we extended our lives and fought back against mortality. And so it has created its own new set of problems. And I think that's, as I say in the book at some point, like no change this momentous is ever fully positive in its effects. And we're going to have to wrestle with, these secondary effects of longevity. That's the great riddle of the next century. It may put a downward pressure on future expansion of life. It may end up being something that comes back, and this upward cycle of the last 100 years does not continue.
Yeah. I feel like it's easy to talk about big ideas like that, and then when you make it personal, it's harder. How do you think about your own? Like I interviewed Zeke Emanuel, wrote for our magazine, like why I hope to die at 75. It was a bit of a exaggeration of his actual argument, but it was like, I won't see doctors after 75, and or I won't seek primary care after 75 because he's conscious of these same issues. How do you think about your own longevity and interest in indefinitely like pursuing medical care?
That's a great question. Nobody's asked me that before. I guess it's early in the book tour, but thank you for that, Jim. My grandmother lived to almost to 105, and she just died a couple of years ago. And she had a long health span. I mean, I think she was driving into her late 90s and wrote her memoirs at 99, and so I was very close to someone who lived a very full life up to 100 and really relished it, like really got to know her great grandchildren and was present for that kind of stuff. And so I guess in part because that is the kind of historic outer boundary of our ability to live. Like very rarely do people live beyond 105 or 110. I have it in my head that, the ideal life is to live into your 90s, maybe to 100 healthily, and then, drop dead in your sleep. I don't have a great appetite to live to 150 or whatever the kind of Silicon Valley dream is. But so I think I will continue seeing a doctor at 75. I'm not quite that radical.
Yeah, no, nor am I. But yeah, exactly.
Gentlemen, what a great conversation. And actually, James, I was kind of wondering, how would you answer the question that you just posed to Stephen? I'm kind of wondering what your own answer would be.
I don't know. I mean, at that age, I'd say no heroic measures. What I said to Zeke was like, if you get an ingrown toenail, or you're not going to get and I, this reasonable things like that I would do, but I think mostly focusing on comfort and quality of life over extending life at that point. Yeah.
Okay, so Stephen, we've had a couple of really great questions come in, so I'm going to pose some of these to you. And let's start with, let's start here. Suzanne asks, could public service, first, actually, before I start asking questions, I want to remind folks we're going to be doing after hours at 8 o'clock. Both Stephen and James will both be there. They're going to have about a 5-minute bio break in between. So you'll be in a waiting room for a few minutes and then we'll let everyone in. Your cameras will be on. You can ask your own questions. It's a nice sparky conversation. So
all the cool kids are going to be there.
All the cool kids, only the coolest kids. And since I'm not very cool, these two guys are cool. You don't want them saddled with just me. So, and poor Anne Marie is cool, so she'll be there. But so join, come get the book. It's a fabulous book. So now 2 questions. Suzanne has asked, could public service messages be utilized to incorporate the message about vaccinations? How can we be better about marketing and sharing of the medical advances about vaccinations?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. I wonder what you think about this too, Jim. But yeah, it's a problem that we have in society in general. I can't remember where I wrote about this. It might have even been in Ghost Map, but it's the advertising business is skewed heavily towards, here's a new kind of detergent, that makes your shirts extra white. It's amazing. It's a miracle, whatever. And so we have our perception of, what's exciting and what's new and what works is heavily skewed by what gets advertised. And if, as we've been saying for this past conversation, if some of the most important things in life, the things that really matter, that keep you safe and keep your children safe, are quietly done behind the scenes by like the waterworks company that that isn't even doesn't have an advertising budget, and no one ever thinks about because there's just water in the kitchen and you drink it. We lose sight of those things, and so yeah, I do kind of feel like there's it's the same thing for government. I mean, like basically government interventions that are important in life. You can easily steer yourself towards a much more libertarian view of the world if it's entirely shaped by commercial advertising, because the government generally doesn't take out promotions saying like, here's all these great things that we do to like keep the roads running. And so you forget that your taxpayer dollars are going to the roads because no one's taking out ads saying like, hey, that highway, isn't it amazing? It just works. So I do think that there could be that. I think there's a specific argument actually that's not public service ads, which is, should Pfizer or Moderna be allowed to advertise, spend their own money on vaccine advertising, which are legally not allowed to right now. And maybe that's a mistake, because if they want to promote this, it has a public benefit for sure. Maybe we should let them.
I know there's some PSAs from the Biden administration, some of the PSAs about vaccination is out there. I'm going to give you a quick question from Tony. He says, if you had children or have children ages 12 to 15, would you vaccinate for COVID tomorrow? Maybe both of you could answer.
Yeah, I as it happens, I have a 14-year-old, and we just got him an appointment today. He's getting vaccinated on Friday. The only thing I will say is there's been an argument that a few people have made, which I'm sympathetic towards, which is there's an argument that the priority should have potentially been getting that extra vaccine supply that would be going to, the younger kids in the US, just getting that to India as fast as possible. But that is where we're making a lot of progress here. We're in a much better place. 12 to 15-year-olds aren't going to be major vectors in a largely vaccinated population. They're not overall at risk with COVID. So we need to take these drugs, we need to take these vaccines and get them to the firestorm right now, for them and for us, right? The longer this virus is circulating, the longer you have evolutionary time where more deadly variants could appear and so on. So that I'm sympathetic to that argument. It wasn't being done, and so we have, for that reason, decided to get them vaccinated, and we're happy with that.
James, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I wouldn't hesitate. Something like 30,000 kids in America have been hospitalized because of COVID. That's a traumatic experience, and about a third of them went to the ICU. And if we don't vaccinate our kids, the virus will infect them. So the option is not like vaccinate or the option is vaccinate or your kid gets COVID-19. Your kid gets infected and has a chance of becoming hospitalized and potentially significantly ill, potentially developing chronic disease. And I think, so that's the way I would think about it as a parent. Which would you prefer?
Thank you for that. I think we might have time for one more. I want to squeeze this in. It is from Anna. She's actually on the Zoom, I think, from Colombia, the country. She says, what about extra life science experiments related to CRISPR? Is genome writing the new answer to all?
Genome writing, yeah. Well, this fabulous new Walter Isaacson book all about this that has just come out. I just briefly kind of allude to it, but to me, there's clearly going to be some kind of gene editing for genetic disorders that is going to be quite extraordinary, particularly for things that are very rare. We're going to take some very unusual conditions and probably be able to just kind of edit them out. As Walter writes about in his book, it's just, there's a whole I think the ethics of like extending life radically are complicated. The ethics of like editing your children's genetic code and once you start opening that, it's a pretty complicated world. I think, to me, Jim, I'm sure knows more about this than I do, but it seems to me like the really promising thing right now is the immunotherapies with cancer, like that breakthrough. We seem to be getting these extraordinary results for the first time in a long war against cancer. There are some amazing things in it. What I love about the immunotherapies is that it has this kind of beautiful parallel to vaccines in a way. In a sense, it's this technique that unlocks the innate power of your immune system to fight cancer, rather than kind of bombarding it from the outside with radiation or chemotherapy. And so that's a really promising frontier right now.
James, anything to add to that before we sign off? You good?
I have nothing to say that's not about COVID-19. I've only thought about that in a month.
Good.
And then
Good.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're at 8 o'clock, so I'm going to wrap up here. I hope some of you can join us for, in my mind, I see these as a continuum of topics to talk about the Montessori baby tomorrow, about the Montessori method when you have infants. It's going to be fascinating. Noon, an unusual time for us, is the start time at 12 noon Central, as opposed to our usual 7 p.m. James, thank you so much. Excellent interview. Stephen, great to see you. I can't wait to watch the next 3 episodes on PBS. For those of you joining after hours, a reminder, we're going to give these nice gentlemen about a 5-minute bio break here, and then you'll be coming in and joining us. So thank you so much, everybody from Fanland, and we'll see you all soon. So thank you so much.